Hello everyone, I'm Den Haring and welcome back to my channel, Fish Den 365. Today we're going to do another bait review. This time it's on the Norman DD22. So this bait's been out for a long time. This is Norman has been around for quite a number of years. And they make a number of different baits. They make a number of crankbaits. It's probably what they're best known for. The deep little N is a good one. They've got a bunch of good crankbaits, but one of the favorites that I have that they make is the DD22, and it's my favorite deep diving crankbait by far. Actually, it's reasonably priced. They have a multitude of colors. They have some different options with silent versus suspending versus rattles. We'll go over all that. So for the price, you just can't beat this crankbait. It catches fish. It has a lot of vibration, a lot of wobble, a lot of back and forth movement, and it just catches fish. It's a known fish catcher, and when you want to crank deep, there's not too many baits better than this one. In fact, in my opinion, there's no better bait better than this one. I really think this is the best one to throw when the fish are down in 14, 15, 16 feet. Now, the DD22, that stands for down deep or double deep, I'm not sure which, and the 22 stands for 22 feet. But in order to get this down to 22 feet, you would have to cast very far. More realistically, it gets down to anywhere, depending on the crankbait, the individual crankbait that you have, it gets down anywhere from 14 to 18 feet. I generally don't get it down much deeper than 18 feet. Now, I probably could if I downsized my line more than I currently do. I usually fish this on the lowest pound test I'll fish this on is 8-pound test. And the reason for that is I don't want to lose them. These things catch big fish. I fish them around a lot of cover. I'm fishing long, rocky points, tapering points. I'm fishing brush piles with these things when I can get them down there. And they catch big fish. And so I usually have a 10-pound test line on. But when I need to get it down deeper, I'll go down to 8. If you went smaller in line diameter, smaller pound test, you'd get this thing down deeper still. And if you were willing to troll the bait, which I don't do, but if you were willing to do that, you'd get it down significantly deeper. That's where it would certainly get down to 22 feet, maybe even more. So what makes this bait so good? Well, there's a number of characteristics about the DD22. It's got this long diving bill. It gets down very deep, very quickly. It goes right down to the bottom. And the bait, you can work this in a number of ways. And it just happens, it's a pretty good mouthful. I think it gives off a lot of vibration, which makes it seem like a bigger profile. And the bass really seem to I usually catch bigger sized fish on this bait. And that's why I like it so much. It's a great bait to use when you might be trying to cover water. Maybe you've got a section of lake that is 10, 12, 14 feet deep, 16, 18, and you just want to cover some water to see what it feels like down there. A road bed, for example. Maybe you want to follow the road bed or the ditch next to the road bed with the bait. Great way to fish this bait. And so it can telegraph what's on the bottom, and you can kind of just learn a lake pretty quickly by throwing this. Much faster than by working a jig on the bottom, for example, where you're just working that jig very slowly, inch by inch. This bait, you're actually crashing it along the bottom. And people have seen me fish this bait already. I'm sure they probably think I'm a maniac. But when do you fish this bait? Well, the best time to fish this bait is summer and fall. This time of year, right now, we're in April, we're in pre-spawn. The bass in my area haven't spawned yet, but they sure are up shallow. They're coming up shallow and they're getting ready to spawn. They're feeding shallow. So this is not a bait I would typically choose at this time of year. But after post-spawn, after the fish spawn and they begin moving out on those points and begin moving out into deeper water and into the summer haunts, that's when this bait comes into play. And so right through summer, right through September, right through October, this bait is a really good bait to throw on a lot of the lakes, at least that I fish. And like I said, it catches big fish. So now that you know that it's a good bait to throw in summer and in fall, that's really where you want to focus your attention on when to throw this bait. Now, the how to throw it is a whole other question. So when the water's really hot and warm, and when we're talking July, August, September, early September, where I fish, I like to throw this bait out as far as I can throw it. I'm using a crankbait rod. It's an old Daiwa S series rod. It's a rod that's got some, I believe, some glass composite in it, and so it's got that flexibility in the rod, because when you hook a fish on a crankbait, you don't want a very stiff rod. You want that more parabolic bend in the rod, so that when a fish runs or comes towards you, you can take up the slack, you can fight the fish. There's always a bend in the rod, which makes it less likely for them to throw these hooks. If you didn't have that, if you had a very stiff rod with a fast taper to the tip, then a lot of times these hooks can pull out of the fish's mouth if he comes to the surface and jumps, or if he changes direction on you. But if that fish is changing direction and you have that bend that goes deeper into the rod, well, that rod can absorb all that, and it's much less likely for the fish to pull off. So there's a little bit about, you know, what kind of rod to use. And then I also like usually a slow gear ratio reel. I don't like to fish crankbaits with anything faster than a 6.2 to 1. Oftentimes I'm using a 5.1 to 1, depending on how deep I want to get it down and how long I'm fishing the bait. But what I'll do a lot of times in the summertime, you know, in the summer where I fish, oftentimes there's alewives, and on the humid days they come up. You'll see them on the surface, and sometimes fish are busting on them, and there'll be giant schools, and the school might be 12 feet deep, 12 foot of depth worth of a school of bait fish, you know, from top to bottom. And so one of the ways I like to fish this is just to throw this around those bait fish schools and reel it down as really fast and erratically. So what it looks like when I'm reeling is this. I'm going 1, 2, 3, stop, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Really, really fast, and then stopping. So that bait's going down and it stops. It's going down and stops, and it makes it very erratic. And that's one of the features of how to get a fish triggered into biting, is that erratic retrieve. When you're on the bottom, it's going along the bottom and it bumps something and it veers off, or it bumps here and it veers this way. That's when this bait oftentimes will trigger a strike. But you can do that in the middle of the water column by how you retrieve the bait with your reel and how you work the bait with the reel. And so I hope to have a crankbait video for you, a deep diving crankbait video this summer. I've never created one, and I've always wanted to. When the conditions are right this year, if I'm available, I will do it, because you'll get to see how I retrieve the bait and how that makes a difference. That erratic retrieve, sometimes you'll get slammed and the bait's nowhere near the bottom. They're just kind of following the bait fish around, but you can get them to strike this thing. And I get big smallmouths doing this too. It's not just largemouths. So it's a fun bait to fish. I like fishing crankbaits like this because it's more active. You know, you're constantly throwing a bait out there, you're covering water, and to me that's a lot of fun. So I have a whole bunch of DD22s laying on the boat right here. And it was just, the purpose of that was just to show you some of the different options that you have. You know, there's a lot of different colors. A lot of these colors, I don't know the names of them. I know the names of some. If anybody is interested in a particular color, just comment at the time of the video of that, you know, what was that color at this time in the video, and I'll find out for you and just comment back. And if there's any other information that I want to get to you about these cranks, I'll put it in the description of the video as well. So I think this is kind of like a root beer color. This is one of the colors that I like. And I'm going to show you the back of the bait has something written on it there, right? I don't know if you can see that. So take a look. When you see me holding these baits, I'm going to pick up every one of them and show it to you. I'm going to move it all around so you can see. There's a couple different things that might be written on them. This is another bait. It's got something written on the side, the back side. It says suspend. So this one actually goes down and it suspends. It doesn't float back up. Sometimes that's nice. It keeps the bait down a little deeper. This one, what that word says on the bottom is silent, right? So if I shake it, and this one's actually a mistake. It's not silent. There is a rattle in there. Norman sometimes makes mistakes with their baits. Here's another one that's silent. This is what it should sound like. What you're hearing there is just this front split ring. No rattle there. So this might be worth extra money, right? It says silent and it's not. Who knows? But so I like the silent ones the most, and the reason for that is I just have more confidence in it, and I think it's because for me, I felt that I've always caught more fish with the silent version. I fish in a lot of pressured waters. I'm fishing Nakamixon, I'm fishing Blue Marsh, I'm fishing Wallen Pawpack. They get a lot of pressure, a lot of fishing pressure, a lot of boat traffic, and I think it helps to have a silent bait. Now there's an exception to that, and that is when the water's high or muddy or a little dirty. Two things that I like to look at then is a brighter bait like this chartreuse black back, and this one with a good solid sounding rattle in it. That's because the water's off color and they need something to hone in on. So I've caught some nice fish on this color crankbait in the past when the water dictated that it's what I should have been throwing, meaning that the water was pretty dirty. So as I show these to you, you'll see some are silent, some are not. We showed you this one, we showed you the root beer one, we showed you this suspender. I don't know the name of that color, but it's kind of nice. Here's another, this is the one that's supposed to be silent, but it's not. And then here's a modification that I made to one that I still fish quite a bit today. And that is, I put a black painting on the back to make it look a little more like an alewife, and I added a tail feather, just a little something different. Sometimes when everyone else is throwing these kind of crankbaits, adding a little something different like that can trigger a few extra strikes. So that's why I do that kind of thing. This one is a sunfish pattern called a red ear. I like that one quite a bit. This one is a silent one. And I believe the color of this is called jelly bean. It's got that clear, but then it almost looks like a bluegill profile, maybe even a bit of a perch. Dark green back, it's got some bars on it. Nothing that really stands out. It's got some clearness to it, and I like that in clear water. This is one of the prettier colors that I have. It's I don't know the name of this color, but I just like it. And I would fish this when the water is a little bit stained. The color I fish the most, usually my go-to color, and you'll notice I have these in silent, is called Nutter Shad. This is a Nutter Shad color. I just like this. It has a little bit of chartreuse along the sides, got dark blue back, a lot of white to it. Looks like a shad, looks like an alewife. So this is one of my go-to colors. And everybody else likes this color too, or something similar to it. Oftentimes they might be fishing a different crankbait, a different company's crankbait, but they're using a color similar to that. And when that's happening, that's when I go to this color. I think this color is called zucchini, but I'm not 100% sure. It's got a dark black back and dark green sides and clear whitish belly. And I've caught a lot of nice fish on this color, both smallmouth and largemouth. Another jelly bean here. This one is another Nutter Shad, but I think it's a clear Nutter Shad, right? It doesn't have, you can see the difference here. This one's got, you can see through it. This one you can't. So this is better even in clear water still. This one could be a better choice in very clear water. Got another zucchini here. We already talked about this bright color. Not sure what this is called, but it looks like a very good perch pattern to me. And so that's why I have it. Anywhere there might be some deep perch, and this one's a silent one too. Let's see if it's truly silent. Yeah, it is. So there it is. I have just a bunch here, and so these are the ones I have hooks on. And what I like to do with these baits, you'll see that the ones I do have hooks on, they're all the same. I convert the hooks. I always pull the stock hooks off these things, and I put EWGs, Gamakatsu EWGs. That stands for extra wide gap. Gamakatsu hooks, and so these are size 2. These hooks are size 2. I like a bigger hook because, especially for largemouth fishing, a bigger hook just stays in their mouth better once you hook them up. So I have every one of these with the same size hook, number 2 EWG from Gamakatsu. Great hook, by the way. It holds very, very well. Something else I do with these baits that I've done over the years, or learned about over the years, is they have a split ring on them, and oftentimes I'll leave that split ring on, but I'll also put a tiny little snap on the split ring. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One is if I want to change my crankbait color, hopefully you can see that snap there on there. But if I want to change my crankbait color, or just my crankbait in general, I just undo the snap, pull it off, put another one on. And I do believe that a very light snap like that allows this bait to have even better action, or even a little bit more action. And so for those two reasons, I fish a snap. And I haven't been, I haven't found that the snap fails. So I just like to do it that way. You don't have to, but for me, it works for me. Now, you see all these baits that I have here, they all have number 2 hooks on them. and they're all ready to fish. But I also have backups. So I have cases like this where I keep my deep diving crankbaits. I have a couple more nutter shads here. I got some other brands of deep divers. And I have over here a ton more of these deep crank boxes. I have medium crank boxes, shallow crank boxes. I have shad shaped flat side crankbait boxes, all different stuff. But so this is my backup box. And I'll explain why I have that in a minute. I have the colors that I like in there, and I back them up. I pull the hooks off them when I put them in here. So if you can see this, you'll see there's no hooks on these baits. They're just ready to have a hook put on them and test. I don't fish these things until I test them. And I might test them at the lake, but I don't fish them seriously until I test them and know that they work the way I want to. And so if you stayed with me this long with this video, this is going to be the most important part perhaps for you, because I'm going to tell you how to know when you have a crankbait that's going to catch fish, because not all of them do, at least not equally. So you already know I've got all these DD22 Norman crankbaits here, right? And here's the thing. Anytime you have a crankbait, and I don't care what the make is, I don't care if it's wood, I don't care if it's plastic, I don't care if it's custom made, they're not all the same. I can have 10 of the same crankbait, same color, but they don't all work the same. And when you have production crankbaits like the Norman DD22, it's a plastic production mold crankbait. It's even more so this way. They don't work the same. I can have 10 of these crankbaits that look identical to you and me, but in the water they're different. They act and behave differently. Some catch fish better than others. Out of a group of 10, I might have 3 that really outshine the other 7. And out of those 3, I might have 1 that outshines the other 2 of the remaining 3. In other words, one fishes so much better than the rest, that's the one I want to throw on when it really matters. And so how do you find when you have that crankbait? Well, experience can tell you that, right? You start catching fish on it, you know you've got one that's special. But you can kind of put the odds in your favor if you know what to look for, and that's what I'm going to tell you about next in this video. So there's 2 things that I'm looking for when I'm testing a crankbait, because I test every one of these before I fish it. And the first one is it tuned properly? So when you're reeling a crankbait in and it goes off to the side, or to this side, it's not tuned. You want it to go straight. Say this is my rod, right? Right here's my rod. You want this bait to track straight to the rod. You point the rod at the bait, you want that bait going straight to the rod as it's wiggling. You don't want it coming off here or coming over here. Because if it does, you're not going to get the full depth out of it, and it's just not tuned right. It won't work as well as if it was tuned correctly. So let's say you've got a crankbait that's running to the left or running to the right, and it's not tuned right. So let's say I'm reeling this crankbait in towards me now, and it's going to the right. It's going to my right. Well, the way I tune that to get it to go straight is I get a pliers and I get on to the line tie, not the split ring, but I get onto the line tie and I just slightly and lightly bend it to the left. So if the bait goes to the right, I bend it to the left. Bait goes to the right, I bend it to the left a little bit, and I throw it back out there and I try it again. And maybe it goes to the right but not as much. Well, then I make another little adjustment. Now maybe it goes to the left a little bit, make another little adjustment the other way. I'll spend time adjusting that thing until it tracks perfectly straight to me. So that's number 1. You've got to have it running straight. Some of these crankbaits, they'll run straight right out of the box. But quite honestly, with Normans, more times than not, you got to tune them. Because, again, that's when you're buying a production crankbait like this, one that's a molded production crank, you got to work a little more. If you're buying someone's custom bait, sometimes they're doing that work for you, and so you'll have a bait that runs much truer right out of the box. But I don't mind tuning them. I know how, and once I do and I have them running the way I want, then the real testing begins. And there's 2 things you want to look for. Number 1, and you really kind of need a boat to do this. I don't know how to do this any other way. But what you want is you want to throw that bait out there as far as you can and reel it down a good steady clip. And just keep reeling until it's back to you. And here's the secret. The crankbaits, and let's say I'm standing in my boat, the crankbaits that go under the boat and almost out the other side, as I'm reeling them, because this thing will dive way down, it'll actually go under the boat because it's got that diving plane. oftentimes if I look back, I can see it back there on the other side, and then it ends up turning around and I bring it back to me. Those are the crankbaits that I want. Those are the ones that are going to go the deepest. If I get a crankbait and I run it to the boat and I can see it down there and it's already coming up to me, it's not going as deep as one that goes under the boat. So I always look for that first. I want a crankbait that goes really far down, and that when I'm reeling it, it actually goes underneath the boat and has to come back to me. That's the crank I want, because that's going to fish deeper and it's going to allow me to do more things with it. The other thing is something that a lot of you are familiar with. It's called hunting, right? We call this particular action hunting. And what we mean by hunting is when a bait naturally goes off to the side slightly, but then always tracks back to the center. So sometimes a crankbait will do that. It'll go a little bit off to the side, but it always wants to find center again. And then it might go off to this side just slightly, but when it wants to find center, meaning it wants to find right where you're pointing your rod again. That's called hunting when it does that. And that oddball side kick where it kicks out just a little bit but then wants to come back is a huge trigger for catching fish when it comes to crankbaits. So that's another thing to look for. If your bait does both of those things, where you can get it way down deep under the boat and it also hunts like that, you got a good one. And you want to keep that and you want to guard it as best you can. I had one of these DD22s. I have a lot that I've caught fish on. But one that I had was really, really special, and I had so much confidence on it. I caught so many fish on it, it was completely beat up. And I never wanted to lose that bait. I caught a lot of 6-pound largemouth on it. And I ended up losing it about 14 feet deep at Lake Nakamix, and I know exactly where it is. It's on a fish crib down there. But I had my 8-pound test on because I was trying to get it down there, and I was having a good day, and I got it on that dang crib, and I pulled up a little too hard, too quick, and I snapped it off. And if I had scuba diving gear, I'd go down there and get it. But I don't, and I never did get that bait back. But since then, I've gotten others that have shown that they catch fish better than the rest. But that one was particularly special. So when you get, and crankbait guys know this, when they get one that's special like that, they'll guard it with their life. They'll try never to lose it. If they do get it hung up, they'll do whatever they can to get it back, because they know it's more likely to catch fish than any other crankbait that you're throwing. That's just how it is. It's one of the things about crankbait fishing. So you're looking for those two things. The deeper down it goes, the better, and also that a little bit of erratic hunting action. Now you can add to that hunting action by what I described earlier, by how you retrieve. By retrieving erratically, it can make it dart and do that kind of thing. And then obviously if you're hitting the bottom, well, that's going to happen naturally, because if there's objects on there on the bottom, it'll get hung up and then pop off. It'll go off to the side. Maybe you hit a rock and it veers off this way. Well, that's when you get slammed, when it comes off those rocks and you just keep grinding it away. That's a lot of times when you get really slammed by the biggest bass that's in the area. That's why they're so much fun to fish. They just catch big fish. Now, sometimes that bait is not on and it's just not the right thing and you just have to do something else, Carolina rig or jig. But when the crankbait bite is on, it's a lot of fun to do, because you can catch multiple fish, and oftentimes there are some of the bigger ones that you'll catch. So if you haven't tried crankbait fishing, or if you haven't tried deep diving crankbaits, give this thing a try. There's one other thing that I want to talk about before I go. Even though this thing is meant to fish in extremely deep water, it doesn't mean that you have to do it that way. I've fished these baits in 8 and 10 feet of water and 12 feet of water a lot. And it just gets down there that much quicker, and you have to be careful that you don't hang it up because it wants to stay down. But that's the whole reason why you might want to do it. Let's say you're on a really tapering long point, and maybe you're sitting in 15, 16 feet of water, but where you're casting is only 6 feet deep. You get this thing down, now it's 8 feet deep, and it's hitting the bottom. And so from 8 feet deep all the way to where you're almost sitting, this thing, if you retrieve it correctly, you're bouncing off the bottom. And so that's what you can do with a deep diver. You don't have to fish it in real deep water. You can fish it in water where it's not as deep, 8, 10, 12 feet, and it'll just stay down there. Now you have to be careful. You might want to go with a slower retrieve, and when you bump something, you might want to let up on that tree, because this bait it floats, except for the suspending model. So when it bangs something, if you stop, it'll just kind of wiggle its way backwards, and then you can continue going forward again. and that's a good trigger too. So oftentimes I'll fish these in multiple depths because I can. It just allows me to do that. So there's another thing to think about when throwing a crank. And then as you're going deeper and deeper, as you're getting closer to the boat, because I'm sitting out in deeper water in that scenario, I can start reeling faster and faster. And sometimes that'll trigger them too, in that you start out slow. Maybe you have a fish following, or maybe he's interested or looking, or he's tracking it, and all of a sudden you start speeding it up and speeding it up and speeding it up faster and faster. It's almost as if it's a prey fish that's spooked by the bass and is trying to get away. And sometimes right as you begin to change the angle of the bait to lift back towards your rod, that's when they'll slam it. So sometimes that, because you reach like the apex and you're at your fastest point in that scenario, and you'd be surprised at how many nice fish you can catch that way. Some days it just works well that way. Some days it doesn't matter, or they're not interested in eating that way. But boy, sometimes they are, and it's good to know about these things and be able to plan for them when you go fishing with a crankbait. Well, we talked a whole lot about the DD22, why I think it's a great crankbait. I hope it inspires you to get out there this summer and fall and fish it. It's a fun bait to fish. When I'm fishing this, I'm always using a bait casting rod, and I already talked about the type of rod and the reel with the gear ratio 5.1 to 1, 6.2 to 1, 6.3 to 1. I usually don't go higher than that, not for this kind of fishing anyway. And so I hope it inspires you to get out there. If you found this video to be helpful, if you liked the video, hit that like button, give me the thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you haven't done so already, it's time to subscribe. Please subscribe. Hit that bell. That'll give you a notification for when the next video is coming out. Can't wait to do another video. Can't wait to get back on the water. Right now we're going through some crazy times with the economy and with COVID-19. But eventually some things hopefully will begin to normalize. I do think that life is going to be a different going forward than it had been. But the closer we can get to some normalcy, the better, and hopefully we can all get out there and enjoy the outdoors and catch some fish. And as you go out there, as always, may God bless your fishing endeavors.